Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of Behind the Frame. As you've seen over the last couple of weeks, each of us guides take an image that we really like from the field, we bring it into the studio, we analyze it, we edit it, we explain why it's our favorite shot. And this week I thought I would do something slightly different in terms of an image. It's an image that I really like. I've just returned from my first week in the Mara and we had an incredible time there, some phenomenal sightings, and I wanted to edit an image for all of you where I didn't quite have my settings right, but shooting in RAW and being able to manipulate my image afterwards in post-processing allows me to get what I actually saw when I was out in the field and fix the minor errors that I'd made. So with that said, I hope that you enjoy this episode of Behind the Frame. So the image I'm referring to, it was I think on day one in the Mara, and we came across a male leopard, Suja, which he's very well known around our parts of the Mara Triangle. He's the dominant male in the area. He's absolutely beautiful. He's been in the wars a little bit, so he's got a very expressive face. And this particular afternoon, we had a chance of multiple walk-bys. So what I mean by that is having him walking towards us, walk past the vehicle, and it allows us to get some nice, powerful images of him as he walks towards us. And shooting in portrait orientation obviously just adds the element of height, and also him on the road coming towards us using the path we can use as leading lines in the image to create the image that we want. So with that said, I'm going to show you the image, and as you can see, this is the raw file. So the beauty of shooting a raw file is that the difference between RAW and JPEG is that RAW obviously contains a lot more information about the image, and you can manipulate a lot more different things within the image, whereas a JPEG is a lot smaller file, and if you get your settings wrong and things like that out in the field, it's very difficult to correct in post-processing. There's only a certain amount of post-processing you can do. Whereas shooting in a RAW, you can pretty much do anything and everything, especially with the technology that we have through Lightroom and Photoshop and the various editing apps. So with this specific image, you can see in this image, it's got a bit of a blue tone to it. So what actually happened here was that I had been shooting in RAW firstly, but I didn't actually check my white balance. So it was a bit of a rookie error on my behalf. Whenever I'm out in the field, I like to prepare the guests for every single shot. So go over white balance. Normally I'm shooting on auto white balance. Here, without checking, or potentially I bumped the camera and my white balance changed off of auto white balance. I find that auto white balance generally gives you a very natural feel of the scene that you're looking at. But my white balance changed to tungsten, which gave it a bit more of a blue effect, which, being a RAW file, allows me to adjust and make a difference with in post-processing. So it's not a major issue that I've got here, but obviously when we're out in the field, we want to maximize our ability with changing settings and getting the correct settings so that post-processing is minimal, if that. So with this specific image, I want to try and obviously get it back to as much as what I saw with the naked eye when I was out in the field, and I want to try and just maybe crop in a little bit, go through my basic process, create a bit of contrast, obviously get that warmth color coming through. It was nice late afternoon, so yeah, the light was really nice, but obviously with my white balance being off, it has that blue effect. So I'm going to start with my normal process, and that's going to be to go through a crop if it needs a crop, looking at the frame, looking at the edges of the frame, and then I'll go through the basic menus, the whites, the blacks, try and create a bit of contrast there. I'll also play with the white balance slider and just try and get that warmth color coming through. I don't want to overdo it because it was a very soft, beautiful warmth color that came through. So let's get stuck into editing this image. Firstly, what I said is we look at a crop. You can have a look here, nothing really. I mean, there's one spike here which would show me that it's probably this area here that's relatively dark, and that's where that spike is coming up, which is perfectly fine. All the detail in that on my subject is preserved. So I'm going to keep it on original ratio. I'm going to bring it up slightly. And because he's walking towards me, look at his body position. So his body position is almost walking towards the bottom left-hand side of the frame. But the story behind this image is, if you look at the way that I'm going to crop this image, he was walking on the road towards us. So we've got the path behind him where he's come from, and we've got the road in front of him where he's going to, or where we assume he's going to. So we're using that line to kind of walk him through the image, and I'm composing him slightly off-center to the right because of the road, but also because of the direction that he's looking. He's looking a little bit more to the left. So I want slightly more negative space on the left for him to look into, and I'm going to leave a lot of room in the foreground and just add a little bit of blur into the image, just because you've got to remember that your eye is drawn to the sharpest and the brightest area of an image. So if we go back to looking at the crop, now we understand why I'm going to crop it like this. You can see the road behind where he's come from. It's nice and blurred. The subject, the leopard, and then the road in front, which blurs out down to the right-hand corner. I'm going to put him just off of center, just off this top right PowerPoint. And the reason for that is because of the direction his body's facing, but also the direction that he's looking. Also, one thing to remember when you do take photos of animals walking towards you is you looking for eye contact. So with that animal coming towards you, you're looking to get some form of eye contact. It's not always easy. Some animals walk looking down, some animals walk looking up, some animals walk looking to the side constantly. So you've really got to time your shot perfectly. And what I really like about this image is that I've got the ears of my subject both facing forward. I've got eye contact. It's not necessarily directed right at me, but that also aids in my composition. And then if you look at this bottom right paw, you will see, well, his right paw, our left-hand side, this paw's motion. So this shows us that he is moving forward. So those are the three things I look for when I am shooting an image of an animal walking towards us. Have a look at the eye contact, the ears facing forward, and the paw movement. So I'm happy with this crop. Now I'm going to go into the basic menu. First thing I do is do the whites. So I'm holding down Option, lifting up whites. As soon as you get to that point, you start to wash out the white area. So I'm going to bring it back slightly. And then the darks, I'm not even going to touch. You can see there's already a couple of areas that are burnt out. Before I move on to making other adjustments, you can choose as shots. So as shots, I was shooting on tungsten, which made it, well, gave it a bluish tinge to it. You can use daylight as a quick fix. That becomes very, very orange. You can use cloudy, which makes it even more orange. And what this is doing is on the Kelvin, you can customize your Kelvin depending on time of day. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to as shot, and I'm going to just use the naked eye to drag this back slightly, because as I mentioned earlier, it was quite a soft orangey glow to it late afternoon. I'll leave it somewhere there. I'm going to lift the shadows here ever so slightly. You see, if I do the slider side to side, so I want to bring out a little bit of detail, but I also, I want to bring out detail on the subject, but I also want to keep these dark areas dark. So what I'll do now is I'll just bring back the blacks a little bit, and you see the change that's made. It's just made these areas behind the subject, behind the leopard, a little bit darker, and now suddenly we've got a lot of contrast from this menu. So what we've done is we've made minor adjustments. We've done a crop to get our composition right. We've done shadows, which is quite a large adjustment that I've made here, but that was to bring out the shadows on him, and then the whites are brought up as well, just to create a bit of contrast between the dark and the bright areas. And then the blacks are brought down because I lifted the shadows so drastically. I brought down the blacks just to keep these darker areas still nice and dark, but preserving all the detail that I need. What you can do as well to add more contrast is you can use the tone curve a little bit, just bring these up. There's no set in stone rule when it comes to using this tone curve. I typically do a lot of my adjustments through using the 4 sliders, the highlight, shadows, whites and blacks. If I do use the tone curve, it's a very slight adjustment, and that's just to create a little bit more contrast, because under the basic menu, I don't like to touch the contrast slider. I prefer to leave that alone and to create contrast through blacks and whites, shadows, highlights, as well as the tone curve. So now we've got the color that we want. What I'm going to do is remember that your eye is always drawn to the sharpest and the brightest area of your subject. So I'm going to go to the masking tool. I'm going to select subject. Let's see how well it does here. Okay, that's pretty spot on. So what I'm going to do is just zoom in on the face a little bit. You can see it's pretty pin sharp. I was telling you earlier about, a big dominant male leopard. He's territorial around camp. You can see his eye on this side, so he's been in a couple of scraps. And these kind of shots where it's either very tight in on the head or you've got him walking towards you, look at the eye contact. It's a very humbling experience to sit and photograph these animals when they're coming towards you, and you get that eye contact because it's a piercing stare, and it just adds to the image and adds to the dominance behind the male leopard. You can see that he means business. He was on a patrol. He was marking territory. So he was making sure that no other male leopards were moving in to take over this area from him. So as you saw, I did a subject select over his whole body, and what I'm going to do is just add a little bit of sharpness. So anything between plus 15 and plus 20, and then clarity I'm going to add plus 20. And remember the difference between sharpness, clarity. Sharpness sharpens absolutely everything, whereas if I just use clarity as well, clarity sharpens the edges of things. So all the fine details that you see around the whiskers, these hairs on the edge, the ears, it's sharpening all of that. And it's just small adjustments, even though he is nice and sharp. It's just those small adjustments that really make him pop. So I'm going to say done. Normally I would do something with the eyes, but it was good light. We're shooting at a low ISO. There's no noise in the eyes. He's looking up. The sun's catching his full eye, and there's absolutely no reason to do anything to the eyes here. I'm very, very happy with the eye contact and also the exposure in the eyes. So let's say done, zoom back out. And so far, this is what we've got. If we do a before and after, quite a dramatic change between the two. And all that is just been making small adjustments through the basic slider, then using the mask tool just to emphasize the leopard and to make him pop. Eyes drawn to the sharpest, brightest, and area of most contrast. That's where eyes are drawn into an image. So what I want to do now is, if you think of it and your depth of field, I was shooting at 7.1. I was using the Canon R6 with 100 to 500. I was fully zoomed in, so shooting at 7.1, which means that I've got a greater depth of field. So it gives me more room for error when taking this photograph, in that, if my focal point isn't spot on, and luckily with the R6 it's got the eye tracking ability, so if I do miss my focal point by a small amount, shooting at 7.1 still allows me the chance to have the parts of the subject that I want in focus, which in this case would be the front quarters, so the two front legs as well as the face. But in doing that, you obviously then have more that is in focus. So what I'm going to do now is, you've got to remember that your focal point is like this across you. So I'm going to blur a bit of the foreground. I'm not going to blur any more of the background. You can go back to the image. I want this area here to be nice and blurred. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to come back to the masking. I'm going to use the linear gradient, and I'm going to drag this up from the bottom, and I'm going to make it quite a drastic. I've got quite a nice feather going on it as well. And then I want to just straighten that up like so. Press O for overlay, take that color away, and then I'm going to literally bring sharpness right down. And with that as well, I'll bring clarity right down. And all that's doing is just creating this blur, or adding more blur to the foreground, and where the animal is walking into. The animal's walking into this area. So now what I'm going to do is, I would like to kind of emphasize the leopard slightly more, without going too much overboard. I'm going to add, not necessarily a vignette, but I'm going to add a radial filter to the leopard, and just darken the edges around the frame and around the leopard without changing the exposure on the leopard itself, because I'm very, very happy with the exposure on the leopard. So what I'm going to do is come over here to the masking, select radial gradient, come to the top of the menu, invert. I'm going to click on, and you'll see now, because that red area is the area that's going to be affected. If I left the inverted unticked, you will see that everything within the feather and the circle will be affected. So as I mentioned, I want to make the outer areas darker. So let's go back to ticking invert. Okay, bring this down, and a little bit wider, and bring this down into the frame. Press O for overlay, and this can be a simple thing of just bringing down the exposure. You see that? If I drag the slider to either side, here I'm going to go minus almost 30, so that's almost a third underexposed around my subject, and it's just a subtle adjustment, but that's all that I think that the image needs. So if we have a look at it, this is the image in full, beautiful, nice, warm colors, blurred out the foreground. The background's nice and blurred. We changed the white balance. We worked with the whites, blacks, shadows, highlights, and the tone curve just to get the exposure correct, and to also create that contrast, as opposed to using the contrast under the basic menu. We've used it through different variations of whites, blacks, shadows, and highlights, and it's really come out nicely. It really pops. There's not too much more I would do. If I press Y, there's before and after, so you can see quite a drastic change. Yes, this was an error on my behalf with the white balance, but being a raw image, it does allow me to make adjustments and to fix my mistakes that I made in the field. And more importantly, it's a good, valuable lesson to always check your settings and make sure that your settings are spot on and that you are happy with them. So one last look at the image. I'm very happy with this. There's nothing around the frame that really bugs me. This blur is beautiful. It's actually a really nice image, as you can see where the leopards come from along the road, where the leopard is, where the leopard's looking. We've left negative space, bottom left-hand side of the frame, and then where the leopard is going down the road to the bottom right-hand side of the frame, where we've blurred this whole area out. So we've created a story here using the road and the position of the animal to create a really powerful image of a dominant male leopard that spends his time around camp. He's not always the easiest to find, but when you do find him, he generally treats you to a very, very worthwhile sighting. And a simple image like this can bring back so many memories of the time that you spent in that sighting with him. I mean, we must have spent over an hour with him, photographing him. And just looking at this one image, I can remember everything from the moment that we found him to the time that we spent with him, what he got up to, watched him scent mark. And the beauty of it was that we were the only vehicle there. So we pretty much had him all to ourselves. It was nice late afternoon, as I mentioned. And I think this just showcases how powerful and strong this male leopard is, and it's good to see that he's still around, and I look forward to heading back up to the Mara and going in search of this guy, because he is always a treat and he always puts on a show, and he is very, very relaxed around the vehicles, which is also great. So that is my edit for today. Behind the frame, male leopard Sujan from the Masai Mara just over a week ago. I hope that you all enjoyed this episode, and let me know if there are any other images that you would like me to edit. I've got a bunch of them. Let me know if there's anything that you struggle with in terms of settings, composition. But for now, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you learned something, and I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll catch up with you all soon enough.